If you like sci-fi stories, please like or subscribe to help our channel grow. Enjoy this story.
The Time Librarian. The library loomed like a cathedral of knowledge over the small town of Eldenbrook. Its spires pierced the gray sky, and the stone gargoyles perched on its ledges seemed alive, their eyes ever watchful. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and wood polish, a comforting aroma to the town's residents, but sacred to one woman in particular, Edith Marlowe. Edith moved through the labyrinthine aisles with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime within the library's walls. Her sharp eyes scanned the shelves, fingers trailing over spines as though greeting old friends. She was petite, with auburn hair swept into a practical bun and a habit of pressing her lips together when she was deep in thought. People often mistook her quiet demeanor for shyness, but Edith was anything but timid. Her mind was sharp, her will resolute, and her dedication to the library unwavering. This was her domain, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in the worlds contained within each book. Yet even here, beneath the vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows, she couldn't shake the sense that something was waiting. The feeling grew stronger one evening as Edith was shelving books in the history section. The library was closed, the usual rustling of pages and low murmurs replaced by the soft creak of her footsteps and the occasional hiss of the wind against the windows. As she reached for a thick, leather-bound volume, her hand brushed against the wood of the shelf, and she froze. There, beneath her fingers, was a swirling pattern carved into the wood. It wasn't decorative, it was precise, deliberate. Edith frowned, leaning closer. The grooves were faint, almost invisible, unless you knew to look for them. She pressed her hand against the design, and with a soft click, the shelf shifted. Edith stumbled back as the section of shelving slid aside, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. Her pulse quickened. The library was old, full of hidden passages and forgotten rooms, but this was something different. She hesitated for only a moment before retrieving a flashlight from her desk. Curiosity, her lifelong companion, wouldn't allow her to walk away. The staircase spiraled down farther than Edith expected, each step echoing softly in the enclosed space. The air grew cooler, tinged with a faint metallic tang, and when she finally reached the bottom, she found herself in a cavernous room unlike anything she'd ever seen. The walls were lined with shelves that stretched impossibly high, their surfaces gleaming like polished steel. Each shelf was filled with books, but these were unlike any in the library above. Their spines glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly light. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a single book bound in black leather. Edith approached cautiously, the flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The book's cover bore no title, only an hourglass rendered in shimmering gold. When she opened it, the pages were blank at first, but as she flipped through them, words began to appear, forming themselves on the parchment as though being written by an invisible hand. The text described historical events with uncanny precision, but what truly startled Edith was the final entry. It described her, not in vague terms but in exact detail. Her descent down the staircase, her discovery of the room, even the expression on her face. Her breath caught as new words began to appear on the page. "Welcome, Edith Marlowe. You are the keeper of histories. Be mindful. Every word carries weight, and every change has a cost." Before she could process what she was reading, a voice behind her said, "You're braver than you look." Edith whirled around, clutching the book to her chest. A woman stood at the base of the staircase, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of the shelves. She was tall, with sharp features and dark hair tied in a sleek ponytail. Her posture was confident, almost regal, and her eyes sparkled with a mix of amusement and something more unsettling. "Who are you?" Edith demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The woman stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor. "Janie?" she said with a faint smile. "Let's just say I'm your counterpart." "My counterpart?" Edith echoed, narrowing her eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means," Janie said, gesturing to the room around them, "that we share a unique responsibility. This library isn't just a library, Edith. It's the Chronologium, a repository of timelines. Every book you see here represents a version of history, and every word written or erased changes the fabric of reality. Edith's mind raced. You're saying I can rewrite history? Janie nodded. Yes, but let me give you some advice. Don't. Not unless you're prepared to deal with the consequences. Edith tightened her grip on the book in her hands. And what about you? Do you change things? Janie's smile sharpened. Of course. The question is, are my changes the solution or the problem? As the weeks passed, Edith found herself drawn deeper into the Chronologium's mysteries. She experimented cautiously, making small adjustments to obscure timelines, a decree rewritten here, a battle averted there. Each time, the changes rippled outward, subtly reshaping the world above. But the more she learned, the more she realized how much she didn't understand about the Chronologium, about Janie, and even about herself. Edith's fascination with the Chronologium deepened with each visit. She couldn't resist exploring its endless aisles, pulling glowing volumes from the shelves and flipping through their pages. Some timelines chronicled history as she knew it, while others described events so bizarre they seemed pulled from a dream. Empires built on islands of floating crystal, revolutions sparked by music, and even worlds where technology had never been invented. The Chronologium's sheer vastness was overwhelming, but it also gave her a sense of purpose. For years, she had felt as though she were waiting for something, a call to action she couldn't name. Now, she had found it. Janie, however, was a constant thorn in her side. The enigmatic woman appeared at unpredictable intervals, always with a smug expression and a cryptic remark. "You're getting too comfortable," Janie said one evening, leaning casually against a shelf as Edith studied a timeline of the early Roman Republic. "I'm careful," Edith replied without looking up. "I only make minor adjustments, nothing that could cause—" "Chaos?" Janie interrupted with a smirk. "Oh, Edith, it's not the size of the change that matters. It's the ripples. One pebble in a pond can still start a tidal wave." Edith finally looked up, narrowing her eyes. "If you're so worried about me, why don't you stop meddling in timelines yourself?" Janie's expression darkened. "Because I don't have the luxury of playing it safe. I'm trying to fix the messes you don't even know exist." Before Edith could respond, Janie turned on her heel and strode into the shadows, leaving her words hanging in the air like an accusation. The next day, Edith tried to focus on her duties in the upper library, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Janie's cryptic warning. Was she really being careless, or was Janie simply trying to rattle her? As she shelved a stack of books, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Marlowe?" She turned to see Liam Carter, a teenager with an untamed mop of dark hair and a passion for history that bordered on obsession. He was one of the library's most dedicated patrons, often staying late to pore over volumes of historical nonfiction. "Hello, Liam," Edith said with a warm smile. "What brings you here today?" Liam hesitated, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "It's my dad," he said finally. "He's leaving again, another research trip." Edith's heart sank. Liam had mentioned his father before, a renowned historian who spent more time traveling the world than with his son. "Have you talked to him about how you feel?" "I tried," Liam said, his voice tight with frustration. "But he always says the same thing. It's important work, Liam. You'll understand when you're older." He clenched his fists. "I don't want to understand. I just want him to stay." Edith studied him for a moment, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "Sometimes," she said gently, "people don't realize how much their actions affect others. It might help if you told him exactly what you just told me." Liam shrugged, looking unconvinced. "Maybe." As he turned to leave, Edith's resolve hardened. She couldn't stand the thought of Liam growing up with the same aching void she had felt after her own father's absence. That evening, she descended into the Chronologium with a singular purpose. Pulling Liam's timeline from the shelf, Edith studied its glowing pages. It chronicled his life in remarkable detail, from his childhood fascination with ancient civilizations to his father's distant but loving influence. Flipping ahead, she found an entry describing his father's upcoming trip, a months-long expedition to an uncharted archaeological site. The text painted a stark picture of the rift that would grow between them, the gradual erosion of their bond. Edith dipped her pen into the inkwell and hesitated. Could she really rewrite this? Would it help Liam, or would she only make things worse? Her hand trembled as she wrote. Dr. Carter postponed his expedition, deciding to spend the summer with his son instead. The book glowed briefly, then settled. Edith exhaled, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over her. Had she done the right thing? Only time would tell. The next morning, Liam burst into the library, his face alight with excitement. "Miss Marlowe, you won't believe it. Dad canceled his trip. He said he wants to stay home this summer and help me with my history project." "That's wonderful, Liam," Edith said, her heart lifting at his enthusiasm. "I'm so happy for you." "Yeah," Liam said, his voice softening. "Thanks for listening yesterday. I think it helped." Edith smiled, though a flicker of guilt tugged at her conscience. She had made the change for the right reasons, but Janie's warning about ripples loomed large in her mind. Was this truly a victory, or had she set something unintended in motion? That evening, Edith returned to the Chronologium to check Liam's timeline. At first, everything seemed stable. His father was staying home, their relationship was improving, and Liam was thriving. But as she flipped further ahead, her stomach dropped. A new section had appeared, describing Liam's future in unsettling detail. His growing passion for history, fueled by his father's guidance, led him to pursue a career in archaeology. But the text took a darker turn, describing how his obsession with uncovering lost truths drove him to take reckless risks. Eventually, it culminated in a single chilling line. Liam Carter unearthed a secret that should have remained buried. Edith's breath caught in her throat. What had she done? The faint click of heels behind her made her stiffen. "I told you," Janie said, her voice soft but edged with steel. "Every change has a cost." Edith turned, anger flashing in her eyes. "And what would you have done? Let him grow up resenting his father? Let their relationship fall apart?" "Yes," Janie said simply, "because that's their timeline, Edith. It's not our place to decide what's best for them." "Then why does the Chronologium even let us make changes?" Edith demanded. "If it's so dangerous, why give us this power at all?" Janie stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "The Chronologium isn't just a tool, it's alive, and it's been testing you since the moment you opened that first book." Edith's heart pounded. "Testing me for what?" Janie's lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile. "To see if you're worthy of being its keeper, and if you fail, it will find someone else." Before Edith could respond, Janie disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone with the weight of her choices. Edith stared at the now closed book in her hands, Janie's words echoing in her mind. "The Chronologium is testing me." She glanced around the room, at the endless glowing spines that seemed to hum softly in their shelves, as though they too were alive. Could it really be sentient? And if it was, what was its purpose? Why test her? Why choose her? Shaking herself free of her spiraling thoughts, Edith returned Liam's timeline to its place on the shelf. She couldn't change the past again. Not yet, not without understanding the long-term consequences of her actions. But the cryptic warning about Liam's future haunted her. What could he possibly uncover that was so dangerous it should have stayed hidden? As she ascended the spiral staircase back to the main library, Edith resolved to take a step back from the Chronologium. Perhaps she'd been too hasty in assuming she could manage its power. Perhaps Janie, for all her antagonism, had a point. But stepping back was easier said than done. 2 days later, Liam returned to the library, beaming as he waved a bundle of papers in the air. "Miss Marlowe, guess what? Dad and I started planning our summer project, and we're going to recreate a Roman aqueduct model. He even said we could visit some ruins next year." "That's wonderful, Liam," Edith said with a smile, though her stomach churned. Seeing him so happy only deepened her guilt. Would his joy fade if he knew she had altered his life? Or worse, was it only temporary, destined to be overshadowed by the dark future she had seen? "Do you know where the books on ancient engineering are?" Liam asked eagerly. Edith directed him to the relevant section, watching as he disappeared behind the towering shelves. She tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept straying to the Chronologium, to the glowing books, to Janie's warning. She had almost convinced herself to let it go when Liam reappeared, his face pale. "Miss Marlowe, there's someone weird in the history section." Edith frowned, rising from her chair. "Weird how?" "I don't know," Liam said, glancing over his shoulder. "She's just standing there, staring at the books. She doesn't look like she's from around here." The hairs on the back of Edith's neck prickled. Stay here, she said, hurrying toward the history section. Sure enough, she found a woman standing in front of the shelves, her back to Edith. She was tall and lean, dressed in a sharp black coat, her dark hair falling in a sleek wave down her back. Edith didn't need to see her face to know who it was. Janie, she said, keeping her voice low. What are you doing up here? Janie turned slowly, her expression unreadable. Just browsing, she said with a faint smirk. You do have an excellent collection. You're not supposed to be here, Edith said, stepping closer. This part of the library is for the public. You don't belong. Janie arched an eyebrow. And who are you to decide where I belong, Edith? Or did you forget we're more alike than you care to admit? Edith's jaw tightened. What do you want? I came to warn you, Janie said, her tone suddenly serious. You've already altered one timeline. Do you really think the Chronologium will let you stop there? I can choose to stop whenever I want, Edith said firmly. Janie's smile returned, but it was colder this time. You think this is about choice? The Chronologium doesn't care about what you want. It's pulling you deeper, one thread at a time, and when it's done with you, it'll discard you, just like it did to me. Edith froze. What are you talking about? Janie's gaze bore into her, and for the first time, Edith saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath her confident exterior. Let's just say you're not the first person it's tested, but if you don't believe me, by all means, keep playing keeper. See where it gets you. Before Edith could respond, Janie turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. That evening, Edith couldn't stay away from the Chronologium. She descended the staircase with a mix of dread and determination, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Janie's words gnawed at her, but she refused to believe she was a pawn. She had made her own choices, hadn't she? As she wandered the glowing aisles, she found herself drawn to a book she hadn't noticed before. It rested on a lower shelf, its spine gleaming faintly. The title read, Edith Marlowe, Keeper's Trial. Her heart pounded as she pulled the book from the shelf and opened it. The first page was blank, but as she turned to the next, text began to appear, forming lines of elegant script. Edith Marlowe discovered the Chronologium and embraced her role as keeper, unaware of the true cost of her decisions. Each change she made rippled outward, weaving a web of consequences that even she could not foresee. The words blurred as Edith's eyes filled with tears. She flipped ahead, desperate to understand what the book was telling her. The pages detailed her actions in chilling detail, the changes to Liam's timeline, her arguments with Janie, her growing obsession with the Chronologium. But it was the final line that made her blood run cold. In the end, Edith's choices would unravel the fabric of reality itself. Her hands trembled as she closed the book. She had thought she was in control, but the Chronologium had been guiding her all along. It had known what she would do, and it had let her do it. As she placed the book back on the shelf, a voice behind her said, Now you see. Edith turned to find Janie standing there, her expression somber. You think this is a game, Edith, but it's not. The Chronologium doesn't care about you. It cares about balance, and if you can't maintain it, it will find someone who can. Then why are you still here? Edith asked, her voice shaking. If you failed, why hasn't it replaced you? Janie's smile was sad. Because I'm not a failure, Edith. I'm its contingency plan, its backup. And if you're not careful, you'll end up just like me. The two women stood in silence, the glowing books casting their shadows on the stone floor. For the first time, Edith saw Janie not as an adversary, but as a mirror, a reflection of what she might become if she didn't find a way to regain control. Edith couldn't sleep that night. She tossed and turned, her mind a storm of questions. Janie's words had shaken her to her core. The Chronologium doesn't care about you. It cares about balance. What did that even mean? Was she just a pawn in some larger cosmic game? The next morning, she arrived at the library early, hoping to distract herself with routine tasks. But even as she sorted and shelved books, her thoughts kept returning to the glowing volumes below, to the ominous words in her own timeline. In the end, Edith's choices would unravel the fabric of reality itself. She had to understand more about the Chronologium, where it had come from, how it worked, and why it had chosen her. And perhaps most importantly, why Janie seemed to know so much about it. Her chance to ask came sooner than she expected. That evening, as she descended into the Chronologium, she found Janie waiting for her. The woman leaned casually against a bookshelf, her arms crossed, and a faint smirk on her lips, as though she had been expecting Edith. "Back so soon?" Janie said. "I thought you might take a day or two to process." "I don't have time for games," Edith snapped. "If you know so much about the Chronologium, then tell me. What is it? Why does it test people?" Janie's smirk faded, replaced by an expression Edith couldn't quite read. "You're asking the wrong questions," she said after a moment. "It's not about what the Chronologium is, it's about what it wants." Edith frowned. "And what does it want?" "Balance," Janie said simply. "Every timeline is a thread in a vast tapestry, and the Chronologium is the loom that keeps it all from unraveling. But the threads are fragile. Pull one too hard, and the whole thing could come apart." "Then why does it let us make changes at all?" Edith asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "If it's so dangerous, why give us this power?" Janie sighed. "Because sometimes the tapestry needs mending. Threads break, Edith. The Chronologium chooses keepers to repair them, but it's a delicate job, and most people—" She hesitated, then added, "Most people aren't up to the task." Edith felt a chill run down her spine. "What happens if they fail?" Janie's expression hardened. "You've already seen the answer to that." Edith thought of the line in her book, the warning about unraveling reality. "That's not going to happen," she said firmly. "I'll figure this out." "I hope you do," Janie said softly, "because if you don't, the Chronologium won't just replace you. It'll erase you." Edith spent the next several days immersed in research, combing through the Chronologium's volumes for anything that might shed light on its origins or its purpose. The glowing books revealed fragments of stories, snippets of lives and worlds that were both familiar and alien. But no matter how many timelines she read, she couldn't find anything that explained the Chronologium itself. It wasn't until she stumbled upon a book titled The First Keeper that she felt she was finally making progress. The book's pages were ancient, the text written in a flowing script that seemed to shimmer as she read. It told the story of a man named Alaric, who had discovered the Chronologium centuries ago, hidden beneath a monastery. Alaric had been the first keeper, chosen to repair the threads of time and prevent the tapestry from unraveling. But the story took a darker turn. Alaric, it seemed, had grown obsessed with the power of the Chronologium. He had begun to see himself not as a servant of balance, but as its master. He had made sweeping changes to countless timelines, bending them to his will, and in the end, the Chronologium had punished him. The final line of the book sent a shiver down Edith's spine. Alaric's name was erased from every timeline. Only this book remains to warn those who follow in his footsteps. Closing the book, Edith sat back and let out a shaky breath. The stakes were even higher than she'd realized. She couldn't let herself become another Alaric. But how could she avoid it when the Chronologium's rules were so opaque? Her opportunity to learn more came unexpectedly. The next day, as she was working in the upper library, she overheard a conversation between two junior librarians, Simon and Hector, who were organizing books in the next aisle. Their voices were low, but not quite low enough to escape Edith's notice. "I'm just saying," Simon murmured. "If I had to pick, I'd say Janie's got the edge. She's taller, more imposing." "Imposing?" Hector scoffed. "Please, Miss Marlowe's got that quiet, mysterious thing going on. And her figure? Come on, it's no contest." Edith froze, torn between mortification and disbelief. Were they seriously comparing her to Janie? She stepped into the aisle, clearing her throat loudly. Both men jumped, their faces turning bright red. "Miss Marlowe," Simon stammered. "We were just, dusting the shelves," Hector finished lamely, holding up a cloth as if to prove his point. Edith crossed her arms, giving them a pointed look. "I suggest you focus on your work rather than whatever it is you were just discussing." "Yes, ma'am," Simon said quickly, ducking his head as he grabbed a stack of books and fled. Hector followed a moment later, though not without casting an apologetic glance in her direction. As they disappeared, Edith found herself shaking her head, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. If only they knew the truth, that she and Janie weren't just rivals, but in some strange, twisted way, the same. "I suppose it's a tie," she muttered to herself with a chuckle. "We do have the same figure, after all." Edith's amusement at the librarian's antics quickly faded as she returned to her work. The reminder of her similarities to Janie, even in jest, struck a nerve. If they shared so much, appearance, demeanor, even this strange connection to the Chronologium, then what else might they share? Was Janie what Edith could become if she failed the Chronologium's tests? She pushed the thought aside as she descended into the Chronologium that evening, her mind set on finding answers. The glowing spines seemed to hum softly as she passed, as though the books themselves were whispering secrets. She approached the central pedestal and hesitated before opening her own book again. The pages were just as she'd left them, detailing her choices, her interactions with Janie, and the growing tensions surrounding the Chronologium. But this time, a new entry had appeared at the end. Edith Marlowe stood at the threshold of discovery, unaware of the cost of what she was about to uncover. The Chronologium waited, patient and unyielding, for her decision. Her heart raced. The book wasn't just recording her actions, it was anticipating them. She slammed it shut and placed it back on the pedestal, her hands trembling. The Chronologium was testing her, but for what purpose? And what would happen if she failed? She turned to leave, but her eyes caught on a nearby book with an unusual title, The Echo of the Keeper. The name tugged at something deep within her, and she pulled it from the shelf. The pages chronicled the life of a woman named Jeanette Hawthorne, her rise as a keeper of the Chronologium, her careful stewardship of timelines, and her eventual downfall. The text described how Jeanette had become consumed by her need to control the threads of history, erasing what she deemed undesirable and reshaping the tapestry to her liking. The Chronologium had tolerated her for a time, but when her changes grew too ambitious, it had acted. The final entry was chillingly familiar. Jeanette's choices unraveled the fabric of reality. The Chronologium erased her name from every timeline, leaving only echoes behind. Edith's breath caught. Janie, could it be? Was she the echo the book described, a fragment of a failed keeper? Before she could process the implications, a familiar voice broke the silence. Found something interesting, Edith? Edith spun around to see Janie standing in the shadows, her expression unreadable. You, Edith said, holding up the book. This is you, isn't it? Janie stepped closer, her lips curving into a faint, bitter smile. So, you finally figured it out. Took you long enough. You were a keeper, Edith said, her voice trembling. The Chronologium erased you. Not completely, Janie said, her tone soft but sharp. I'm what's left, a shadow, a warning. The Chronologium keeps me around to remind you what happens when you fail. Edith stared at her, a mix of pity and horror churning in her chest. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me? Janie asked, tilting her head. Or would you have dismissed me as your enemy, the way you have every other time we've met? Edith didn't respond. She couldn't. The pieces were falling into place, but they painted a picture she didn't want to see. Over the next few days, Edith threw herself into her research with renewed urgency. If Janie was an echo, a remnant of a failed keeper, then Edith had to find a way to avoid the same fate. But every book she read only deepened her unease. She discovered a timeline where an early keeper had prevented a catastrophic war, only for the absence of that conflict to lead to a more devastating one a century later. Another keeper had tried to eradicate disease, only to create conditions that led to widespread famine. The pattern was clear. Even the most well-intentioned changes carried unintended consequences. The realization was paralyzing. How could she act when every choice seemed doomed to backfire? Yet doing nothing wasn't an option either. The Chronologium had chosen her for a reason, and it wouldn't let her walk away. Her turmoil came to a head one night when she found herself face to face with Liam's timeline again. She hadn't dared to touch it since making her initial change, but the memory of the ominous line about his future haunted her. Liam Carter unearthed a secret that should have remained buried. What was the secret? What would he find, and why was it so dangerous? Edith hesitated, her pen hovering over the page. If she removed the change she'd made, his relationship with his father would suffer. But was that better than letting him stumble into disaster? Before she could decide, the book began to glow more brightly, and the words on the page shifted. The line about Liam's discovery disappeared, replaced by new text. Edith Marlowe intervened once again, altering the course of Liam's destiny. Her choice, though well-meaning, set in motion events that would forever reshape the tapestry. "No," Edith whispered, stepping back. "I didn't do anything." But the glowing books around her seemed to hum louder, as though mocking her protest. The Chronologium wasn't waiting for her to act. It was pushing her, forcing her hand. "Stop it," she shouted, slamming the book shut. The hum faded, leaving her in silence. But the sense of foreboding remained. That night, Edith had a dream, or perhaps it was more than a dream. She stood in the center of the Chronologium, the glowing shelves stretching endlessly in all directions. The books floated from their places, circling her like fireflies. She reached for one, but it dissolved into light before her fingers could touch it. "You can't control it, Edith," a voice said, echoing in the empty space. "You can only guide it." She turned, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The light grew brighter, enveloping her, and then she woke with a gasp, her heart racing. The words from the dream lingered in her mind. "You can only guide it." What did that mean? Was it a message from the Chronologium itself, or just her subconscious grasping for answers? One thing was certain, she couldn't keep avoiding the truth. If she was going to be the keeper, she had to understand the full scope of her role and the risks that came with it. The next morning, Edith arrived at the library before sunrise. She had barely slept, her dream replaying in her mind on an endless loop. "You can't control it. You can only guide it." The words felt like a riddle, and the Chronologium wasn't in the habit of giving straight answers. She would have to find her own. Descending into the Chronologium, Edith felt the oppressive hum of the books more keenly than ever. It wasn't just her imagination. They wanted something from her. They glowed brighter as she passed, as though vying for her attention, but she ignored them, heading straight to the central pedestal where her own book rested. When she opened it, she wasn't surprised to find a new entry waiting for her. Edith Marlowe stood on the precipice of understanding, her actions shaping the balance of all things. But the balance was fragile, and one wrong move could tip the scales. The scales. The balance. Always the same language, but never any clarity. Edith pressed her palms against the cool surface of the pedestal and closed her eyes, willing herself to stay calm. She needed to think. What did balance mean in this context? Was it keeping timelines stable, preventing changes from cascading out of control, or was it something more profound, an equilibrium between action and inaction, creation and destruction? She thought of Liam, of how one small change had rippled through his life, turning his father's absence into a bond they both cherished. But it had also planted the seeds of an obsession that might lead to catastrophe. Was that balance? Was that what the Chronologium wanted from her? Not perfection, but a willingness to embrace the uncertainty of her choices. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. "You're getting closer." Edith turned to see Janie leaning against a nearby shelf, her expression oddly gentle. For once, she didn't look smug or guarded. She looked tired. "Closer to what?" Edith asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Closer to understanding," Janie said. She stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the glowing book in Edith's hands. "It's not about fixing things, you know. It's about harmonizing them." "Harmonizing?" Edith echoed, frowning. "What does that even mean?" "It means accepting that no timeline is perfect," Janie said. "There's always going to be suffering, loss, chaos, but there's also beauty, joy, and resilience. Your job isn't to erase the bad or amplify the good. It's to make sure both can coexist without one destroying the other." Edith studied her, searching for any hint of deception. "If you know so much, why didn't you tell me this before?" Janie smiled faintly. "Would you have listened?" Edith sighed, conceding the point. "So what do I do now? How do I harmonize things?" Janie's smile faded. "That's for you to figure out, but I'll give you a piece of advice. Stop trying to control the Chronologium. Let it guide you." Over the next few days, Edith approached her role as keeper with a new perspective. Prosody percent. She stopped making changes impulsively, focusing instead on understanding the natural flow of each timeline. She read voraciously, delving into histories both familiar and alien, searching for patterns and connections. It wasn't easy. The temptation to intervene was always there, especially when she came across timelines marked by tragedy. But she resisted, reminding herself that her role wasn't to play God, it was to protect the balance. Her newfound restraint was put to the test one evening when she stumbled across a timeline that sent a chill down her spine. The book was titled The Last Keeper, and its pages described a future where the Chronologium no longer existed. In this timeline, unchecked chaos consumed the threads of reality, collapsing entire worlds into nothingness. Edith's hands shook as she read the final line. The last keeper's failure led to the unraveling of all things. The book didn't name the keeper, but Edith didn't need it to. She knew it was her. Thinking about fixing the future? Janie's voice made her jump. Edith looked up to see Janie standing in the aisle, her arms crossed. "It's me, isn't it?" Edith said, holding up the book. "I'm the last keeper." "Maybe," Janie said, her tone carefully neutral. "Or maybe this is another test." "A test of what?" Edith demanded. "My ability to leave it alone? My willingness to trust the Chronologium?" Janie's lips curved into a faint smile. "Now you're asking the right questions." Edith exhaled sharply, her frustration mounting. "You're infuriating, you know that?" "Part of my charm," Janie said with a wink. Then her expression turned serious. "Look, Edith, I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I will say this. The Chronologium doesn't want perfection. It wants harmony. And sometimes, harmony means knowing when to let go." That night, Edith sat at her desk in the main library, staring at the blank page of a notebook. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of timelines, choices, and Janie's cryptic advice. She thought of Liam, of his father, of the changes she had made and the ripples they had caused. She thought of the tapestry, the fragile web of threads that connected every timeline. And she thought of herself. Not as a hero or a failure, but as a thread in that tapestry, no more or less important than any other. Slowly, she picked up her pen and began to write. Not in the Chronologium, but in her own notebook. She wrote about the choices she had made, the lessons she had learned, and the questions she still carried. The words flowed freely, untangling her thoughts and clarifying her purpose. When she finished, she set the pen down and looked out the window. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the library's Gothic spires. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers. She probably never would. But that was okay. She was the keeper, not the master. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The end. Let us know in the comments. If you could rewrite one moment in history, what would it be?
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this sci-fi story. Please like or subscribe to help this channel grow.